Morning, everybody. I'm going to kick off. The blocked or blockchain, I think, is the title that we're at, which we're talking the future of the enterprise and blockchain. So I'm Jenn Hirsch. I am the Global Technology Trend Scout at EY, and everything I say after this reflects my opinions, not the opinions of my employer. So we had a panelist drop out, so I'm serving as lead discussion person as opposed to moderator. And what I want to kick off with is, as a futurist, I think a lot about how technology is the realization of the tools of our own desires. And I'm trying to capture the subconscious and unconscious needs that we have that predict where we're going to head in the future. So as I look at the development of this community, I think three themes are relevant. One is trust. We're looking for more and more trust from our environment. Two is control. And three is, as we're thinking about this, we're making explicit the processes and systems that have governed us for so long. And that is one of the most important things about this Web 3.0 to me. And the enterprise, as I see it, why I'm so excited about this discussion, apart from being a member of an enterprise for the first time in my entire career, 20 years in technology, is we haven't found a better way to organize people at scale in modernity. And I'm thrilled. I'm going to have my panelists introduce themselves. And the one thing we just found out we all share is we all have ties to Chicago. So anyone in there, Chicago, woo! And so I will first have my former colleague, Chris Danusiar, now CEO, introduce himself.
Hello all, Chris Danusiar. I spent most of my career, in fact all of my career, doing technology in what we call professional services, consulting, auditing, et cetera. And then about 40 days ago, I left that behind and joined a blockchain startup. Joined the wild side or the dark side or the good side, we'll see. But delighted to be here. Audit Chain is where I work now.
Niraj.
Hi, my name is Niraj Pant. I work on the investment team at Polychain Capital in San Francisco. And before Polychain, I was a student at the University of Illinois studying computer science and working on cryptocurrency research for about a year there.
Awesome. So let's kick off the big question. What really is an enterprise? What do we mean when we say enterprise? It's almost overused in technology. I built SaaS for the enterprise. I'm enterprise level software. What is an enterprise? Chris.
I guess for me, it all started in the early 1900s, right, with the kind of incorporation mindset and legality that said, that corporations or enterprises exist to benefit the shareholders. And we've been marching along that route for 100 years now.
So the regulatory emergence is really important.
Yeah, and the legal environment, right? How you raise capital, how you spend capital, how you benefit shareholders and stakeholders. I think that's classically what we would call the enterprise. I think we've thankfully evolved a bit beyond that with B Corps and some sense of, beyond the shareholder value. So we're talking about culture impact, societal impact. But I think enterprise is still a big legal behemoth.
Niraj?
Yeah, I think it's a really good way to frame it, and maybe to take it from another angle, it's really like how we organize ourselves at scale. Back to your original point, you can pick a bunch of different innovations like double entry accounting, or more recently, creation of new governmental regulatory frameworks for governing what a enterprise looks like. But I think it's a way of organizing hundreds to thousands, even more people in creation of some larger goal.
Right. And arguably, it's a human need. We kind of want to organize ourselves. And in today's environment, with capitalism being a dominant structure, it's a lot of ways how people get paid. It's a lot of ways how we exchange value as well.
That's right.
So can today's enterprise endure? Can it remain the way it has since the 1900s?
Personally, I think for about a decade or so, not 20 years, as a predominant structure.
Why a decade?
I just think the inertia or the kind of momentum of the counter movements, whether it be open source and crowdsourcing and the connectivity that we're all experiencing here physically, but then when we leave electronically, is powerful. And I am old enough to have been in the era of kind of sticking up our nose and disdain for open source because it was just, who would ever do that? Why would you share what you're doing without getting, paid by the hour to build it? And I've been through the transformation in the corporate environments where in the last 10 years, we've embraced it, right? And it's taken a lot of re-education, a lot of rethink. I don't think this sort of legal and regulatory and kind of inertia of an organization changes overnight, but 20 years from now, I don't think it'll be predominant.
But to play devil's advocate, you just said we're quick to learn. You can introduce something, so can the enterprise learn?
Slowly, in our experience, like
right.
if I
no,
hasten
yes,
that, right?
Absolutely.
But I think for me, it's important as I think about this enterprise. You're right; it's people, and if I think about humans and people, certainly we're relational beings, right? We're social, so there's something about an enterprise that meets that need. We have some other ways to meet that relational need. I think outside of an enterprise. The other thing I think that comes to mind is, we all deep down, whether we're vocal about it or quiet, we have values, we have beliefs, things that we want to perpetuate or support. And so enterprises have historically given that ability to gather, to be relational, and to kind of go after a value or a belief. But I don't think we need a legal enterprise to do that anymore.
Well, Niraj, I wouldn't have you answer that question, but do you think in Web 3.0 we're going to be explicit about those needs and values?
Sure. As this relates to your earlier question, I think it's an interesting one to think about. It's hard for me to put a timeline as to how long this notion of an enterprise will last, but I think there will be a number of places where humans are not necessary anymore. And as we've seen with blockchains, with new software products, they tend to drive the marginal cost of creating something to zero. And as you continue to innovate in this space, I think there'll be a number of places, such as lending in banks or, traditional players that maybe don't need to be there. Another thing maybe like DNS. These players, I think, the cost here will go down to zero, and then humans won't even have a place to operate. So I think that's where a lot of the initial places will occur for enterprises to sort of go away or change.
Right. And I think one thing, too, that I want to mention, the regulatory environment, the legal environments. I see an interplay right now between communities of people who organize themselves and communities that have given legality. And one thing that's true about tech, and especially this world, is it transcends borders, it transcends governments, it transcends a lot of these things, but yet there's that pull of the way we have organized ourselves and what's enabled legal, quasi-rules. And the struggle, governments don't change very, very slowly. And so, that role is hugely important. It
is. I think I was right, though. The historic kind of intermediary, right, the single source of the truth or single source of regulation is being challenged in every direction. Mm-hmm. I think as we more and more figure out how to kind of program or make the transactions go to zero, right? The cost of a transaction goes to zero. We know if this happens, this is how we recognize the revenue. This is how we deal with the cost. We don't need an army of people to do that. We do the work. The work is captured, and transactions are captured, kind of in transparently regulated, if you will.
So who's going to be those regulators of the future, Chris? Who's going to be the people, the watchdogs? Are they bots? Are they what role do people have? I don't know. Certainly, as my former firm, your firm, was fond of saying, as we were embracing AI, machine learning in the audit practice, where there was a big concern. So the auditors were saying, well, if we're embracing AI and machine learning and robotics, process automation, then why do we need auditors, right? So we were fond of saying that we're taking the robot out of the auditor. It doesn't mean the auditor goes away, but the auditor, responsibilities are elevated to that judgment, to that thinking, to the non-linear, non-transactional type activity. But that's not a simple answer. So we can't automate judgment?
We can over time. Right now, we can't.
Niraj, anything to follow up on there?
Could you repeat the question one more time?
So can we automate judgment?
Yeah, I think so, to some extent. it's difficult to automate, obviously, like very complex processes, and I think this is where humans are really good at, is, again, like organizing large groups of people and data and information. But there's a number of things where I think, again, there are maybe humans there that shouldn't be there and can be automated by software. So again, it's sort of like all getting at building like building blocks to further automate a lot of the complex processes we have today.
So switching gears a little bit, what do you see enterprises getting right about the adoption of blockchain? You know, Chris, you talked about the AI and ML learning and assurance, but what sort of, whether, you know, firsthand experience or accounts of, what do you think they're getting right so far?
Can I go second?
Yeah, so I think there have been a number of interesting attempts at, you know, what enterprises can do in the space today. It's likely a bit early to where we'll see large-scale adoption of blockchains as a business tool by enterprises today. But I think there's been a number of interesting attempts. I mean, the sort of one that everyone talks about is like the supply chain automation. I think there's a number of challenges with the settlement and the actual usage of supply chain metrics on a blockchain. But I think there have been a number of interesting attempts at other uses. So things like us being able to, me being able to send you a query to a database that's private, but I need some information out of it. Like JP Morgan had their project, I think in collaboration with Zcash to basically work on this. And I think that's a really interesting look at how can we take not only just a blockchain, but new cryptographic methods that have emerged from all this innovation. And I think that's a really cool new direction to go watch.
So they definitely need cryptographic methods. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things that enterprises have gotten right is that they've taken notice of blockchain, that they do sense it's important, if nothing else, threatening. It is important and it is threatening. So I think they're getting it.
So what are they getting wrong, though? I mean,
it's easy to pass judgment now, so early on in the evolution of the technology. But I think personally, I think there's an over confidence or expectation that private blockchains is just a better, more clever database, right? And so it's just the next MySQL or NoSQL. It's just the next. I don't think that's true. I think it's much more than that. And I think the power of the blockchain is much more than its database capabilities. But in my experience in the corporate environment, that kind of multi-party database notion is where the emphasis is and where the focus is. And so you get private blockchains. I think, for me, the number of private blockchains are going to dwindle over time, and public blockchains are going to be the ascendant reality.
So similar to the open source movement.
I think so.
But on the notion, like right now, so much of the enterprise says, well, why don't I just have a better database to solve this? Why don't I just have a better encrypted version of data? Why the blockchain?
For me, the answer is it's in the decentralization, it's in the autonomy. But that's not a passion for many enterprises, right? So I think that they're going at the multi-party transaction, the database nature of it, rather than the autonomous governance nature of it.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with a lot of that. I think they're using it probably in the more obvious ways, where I think there's today, while the technology is still really early, I think things like trust minimization is really interesting. Moving trust from the I keep saying the word trust, but from the human processes to things like cryptography and software, and allowing these to happen in a more trustless way on a blockchain, or new cryptographic methods to go search a database, or to organize people. So I think in some ways that's likely where they're not spending enough time, and it's still early. And then I think the other thing that maybe they're not looking at is almost again, like trying to use the database almost as like a crutch, and using the blockchain just as the property of a database, which is actually not a very good database. But using that as a crutch for new tools, and I think that's probably not the right direction today.
You said something really important about trust, right? And the enterprise has existed for so long. What kinds of trust do they have today as currency that they can think about and apply? Like, what's the types of trust that an enterprise does enable?
So I think there's a number of things. There's obviously trust between corporations and enterprises, but even within an enterprise, there's trust. You're trusting a manager to manage their their employees in a solid way. And the great thing is, a lot of these enterprises have existed for so long that we understand what, or not even understand, but if one piece breaks, hopefully the enterprise can still run efficiently. So if you could repeat your question one more time.
What trust currency do they have? So you said managerial. Yeah. You said business to business kind of trust. They're talking to each other at these massive levels. So Chris, anything to add?
What comes to mind to me is kind of reputation and brand, right? You see someone wearing a certain T-shirt or a certain brand, and you get a sense of who they are, what they stand for, what their organization stands for, and that adds trust, right? Over time, you can build it up; it can go down quickly, but that enterprises certainly monetize and rely on that trust.
So, how does the blockchain augment or add to that? Maybe philosophical, but
yeah, it displaces it in a sense, that, right? I mean, just as we're trying to get in blockchain to a kind of trustless, right? I don't need to know who you are, what your reputation is. I just know you exist and you want or need or done something, and I can trust cryptographically that you are who you say you are, and the transaction comes as. So it really does displace it or replaces it rather than kind of supplements it.
Yeah, I would say I would agree with that. I think it's replaced a lot of, or hopefully will replace a lot of the things like needing identity or needing to know who the counterparty is, reducing counterparty risk in transactions. But then there's also a lot of exciting experiments around this concept of like a DAO, decentralized autonomous organization. How do we manage capital or people at the scale of a blockchain? So I think a great example of this is a project like MakerDAO. Initially started as a very centralized, debt-backed stablecoin system, and hopefully they can sort of start to decentralize more of the aspects of this. So things like the upgrade process, or setting interest rates. And I think this is a good example and good, initial sort of experiment at this. Hopefully a structure that will permeate throughout a bunch of different projects.
So. In the next question, I mean, that's a great segue to the next question, which is, what types of new organizations are springing up, like the DAO, like a MakerDAO, that look to rival the enterprise? Like, what are some of the things that are vying? We're so early stage here. People are still storming and norming in terms of different groups. Like, you've got decentralized communities across the globe. You've got co-located teams, but everybody's trying to achieve something different. Like, what do you see as kind of systems that are going to rival the enterprise?
Yeah, certainly fintech has exploded, relatively speaking, compared to, I think, most other industries in their adoption, embracing of Web3 and some of the disintermediation of the standard banks and the standard mechanisms. We're certainly trying to push that a bit at Audit Chain and getting, frankly, the forward thinking, those CPAs and kind of financial statement technology people who are willing to think about something completely different, and just starting to get conversation around that, around the decentralization of reporting. Fintech's a great, I think, a pervasive, good example where the startups have started and the big banks have embraced it and realized it's indeed a next generation threat. They themselves need to become fintech.
So something that's interesting there, though, is that these are groups grouped by industry, grouped by function,
very much.
Versus the enterprise, which kind of does everything, right? Like that's one of the things that the enterprise have grown into, behemoths who do everything. But one trend is actually specific functions, whether industry or activity, like very specific.
I think, and most things start that way, right? In the very kind of a scope that's manageable. And just like now, I think we're seeing, and we've talked about here already, just the kind of specific technologies or specific chains or specific, and over time there has to be an ecosystem, a constellation of reliable interaction between myriad of blockchains or myriad of enterprises. It's just natural that it's going to start in silos until that connectivity is figured out.
So one thing we can perhaps learn from the enterprise is what we would call B2B communication, but it'll be something more beyond that.
Absolutely.
Could you repeat your question one more time? Sorry.
Right.
Jet lag is hitting me harder than I thought.
I know. So thinking about like what other kinds of things does the blockchain community do well to rival the enterprise? So apart from MakerDAO, like how are they going to group? What are interesting communities or things that are springing up to rival?
Yeah, I think a lot of the experiments in the blockchain space today is people are trying to create new primitives to essentially disintermediate some function. So maybe this is a contrived example, but even non-fungible tokens is an example of this, right? The use cases of a non-fungible token in a game or in a sort of software product is they want to remove what the publisher previously had as a moat or a competitive advantage. So NFTs is a great example. People are trying to disintermediate how we do organization of data and things of this nature with things like TCRs. So I think all the different verticals are people just building new primitives to create and organize a software product and to hopefully potentially remove what traditionally was a centralized software product into a trustless one.
So I'm going to move to one thing that the enterprise does do well, which is it supports its people, especially from a US-centric point of view. That's where you go to get your healthcare. That's where you go to get your network. It becomes, for a lot of people, a substitute for an outside party. How will the blockchain allow people to do that if we have these very decentralized, non-connected bits?
Haven't thought about it. I think there's certainly some examples in the U.S. of non-traditional healthcare, as an example, where pools of people gather and because they have a certain, certain affinity or belief or antagonism towards the status quo, and they pool and they figure out how to, kind of self-insure across a pool. There's got to be ways for a blockchain to keep track of the transactions of who you are. I mean, to power that sort of gathering, which is not traditional. It's not because a regulator said you have to do it or because a law said you had to do it. It's because there's an affinity and people want to gather and have a way to transact and share.
So removing the enterprise actually necessitates that feature.
Definitely.
Okay.
I think there's got to be some other way for those needs or those perceived needs to be met, and they will come.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I'm answering this correctly, I think one of the great things about enterprises today is they're willing to experiment with it in whatever fashion they can. So I think things like providing money or providing human resources into a bunch of various different research topics, I think is really exciting to see today. And it's been embraced even in only like 10 years with the technology. It's been embraced pretty heavily by the space.
So, last question. Yeah. We're talking a lot about the future and about, 10 years' time, maybe 20 years' time, the world looking radically different. Because I think the belief is this is going to happen because people are demanding it. Where do you want your kids to work and how do you want your kids to work? And Niraj, that may be a longer time off for you. It's okay. So, I'll let you go first.
Okay. Yeah, it's tough to say. I think a lot of what the cool things about crypto today, not only is it allowing for a more decentralized style of work. We've seen a bunch of teams, not have employees in one central location, but rather organize in hubs in a bunch of different cities. So this is a really exciting experiment to watch. So hopefully over time, my kids can like be working on a beach and be contributing to a software project. So I think that's one way. Another way I think that's been really cool, and we've seen recently with companies like Uber, is just being able to dial up or dial down and find work wherever possible. Almost creating like a liquid market for work is like a really interesting topic. Because today it's quite friction heavy. It's quite driven by geographical and sort of national borders, and hopefully over time these frictions can erode, and you can just really easily be able to go work or contribute to a company.
So I have the benefit, I think, of having 3 young adult children who I've been trying to coach this way for a while. 2 things. One, I think it goes back to earlier topic where, as humans, we're relational, social, and whether you're vocal about it or not, I think there's kind of values and beliefs that you either align to or don't align to when you participate. So I've certainly encouraged them, find a place where you can get those sort of needs met, where you're aligned to the organization or the enterprise or the open network that you're contributing to. But what I've really been saying when they were young, I would say, work hard, have fun. Was something I could say as a dad of these little toddlers, and whether they were playing soccer on the field or in their school project or getting their first job, is just work hard, have fun. I've changed that now that they're young adults, because working hard is kind of a diminishing return, right? There's only so much time, there's only so much energy. So now I say work smart and have fun, and in the end, that's what I coach them on. Just be smart about it and have fun while you're doing it.
Awesome. We've got a great audience, so I want to turn over to some questions here. Feel free to shout them out. We can hear pretty well. Gentleman in the back, I don't know. No?
I'll ask a question.
Sure.
To your point, to what extent do you think blockchains commodify people and processes?
That's an excellent. To what extent do you think blockchain has commodified people and processes? I think it actually has the potential. I'll start with that, and you guys can follow. I think it has the potential to do that massively. I think it has the ability to be capitalism on steroids. And I think that the only people responsible for holding that back are the people who are architecting the system.
It's a difficult question. I think to the extent it's commodified people, I don't think it has yet, and I don't know if it will even in the near-term future. What it has done is it's again built a new system that requires much less coordination maybe than a traditional equivalent. So an example of this is a blockchain that creates some sort of digital asset. It's a lot easier to create and spin up a digital asset that's controlled by some stakeholders today than it was the U.S. government trying to create the dollar in the 1800s and 1900s. So that's an example where it's just made the process more efficient. And I'm hoping that with new decentralized applications and new blockchains that thing that's happened on the digital asset side can permeate towards all other applications.
Yes.
If you guys define an enterprise as a bunch of people working together, how do you guys see new incentivization models have an impact on this organizations, new form of organizations, and have you seen any interesting examples?
So to repeat the question, if the enterprise is a group of people, what new incentives have we seen for different behaviors within the organization? And any examples we may have.
Great question. And indeed, I've been thinking back, a book I read like 20 years ago by Thomas Sowell, Incentives and Constraints. And it often comes down to that, kind of people's behavior and societal change. The one novel incentive organization organized around a polyarchy is Valve, right? The game maker, and they do the STEM, the big environments, and their own kind of polyarchy and kind of social proofs and where they go and what they do is fascinating, and it's not bureaucratic, it's not top down, it's not even kind of a traditional sort of Scrum or anything. And I think there are some definitely enterprise level novelties out there on the incentives. I don't think though that we've tapped into the kind of blockchain enabled incentives for organizations. And I can't think of any examples. I don't know if you have any examples, but they've got to be there. We're looking at supply chain and other sort of efficiency plays at this point, not necessarily incentives for group participation.
Yeah, I think there's two different levels to it. There's incentives in a blockchain corporation or corporation that builds a blockchain or some sort of decentralized product. And then there's also incentives within like a blockchain network. So I think one interesting thing is that if you were to launch a project today and have it go live, you can have like a liquid traded asset that has some sort of market value to it, and it less so matters about the stuff we've seen in traditional enterprises. So I think a good example of this we've seen in our portfolio is that Project teams don't even sort of need to have a physical location or have developers all in one place. Instead, they are sort of paid on a per project basis. You know, one company might release a bunch of different tokens or projects, and they can get basically remuneration based on what they contribute to and what they do. So this is one thing more on the company side that I've seen that's interesting to watch. But I think hopefully as the emergence of new DAO structures permeate and hopefully work, then we can see new types of incentivization mechanisms for providing work to a network.
So 2 examples. One, Richard Crabe created, I think the company's name is Numerai, but it's a replacement for a hedge fund. And that's really explicit. That's a system we already know. And hedge funds compensate their top employing people, and they used a token to compensate that. And that was, when I first saw it, which was about 4 years ago, before the emergence, I was like, okay, I think I get it, because this is the same kind of people, the same kind of talent, and the same kind of compensation. A new platform I've seen is a company called Decent. It's healthcare. So to your point, it's actually using tokens to create similar health behaviors among communities of people. But again, that's linked to explicit monetary value or a tokenized value. I haven't seen anything yet that does a really good job about meaning or values. And I wonder if we'll get there, not when. My question is if. Can we be explicit enough about using this technology to get there? Because that's really what brings people to work. Yes, money matters, and yes, a value matters, but it's really what's more meaningful for you. And we haven't made that explicit yet, and I would love to see that happen in Web 3.0. Yes, in the back.
What are novel ways for companies trying to succeed in this space to monetize delivering enterprise blockchain technology?
That's a good question. Okay, what are novel ways for companies to monetize delivering blockchain innovation to the enterprise? Chris, I'm going to give that to you. You've been deep in both.
The only first thought comes to mind is in partnering, right? Finding a shared pain or shared opportunity. We've seen some corporate success, whether it be in supply chain or distribution or royalties, payments, or provenance of assets, that corporations, enterprises see the efficiency benefits, or they see the security benefits, or they see the kind of quality of data benefits of a blockchain, and it's a better mousetrap on a process they already know or a part of the business they already have.
Yeah, I think there's no perfect catch-all business model yet, and every company in the space is trying to experiment with it. There's the recent sort of ideated concept of tech for tokens. You sell your project technology to a company in exchange for tokens on their network. You launch a blockchain that they use. You sell some sort of service that they can use to facilitate actions on the blockchain. But I don't think there's a good catch-all business model yet, and I think that's what companies are trying to solve today.
Scalability issues in the public blockchain, but also if you're re-engineering corporations, because corporations are meant to minimize transaction costs, and as the transaction cost is coming down with the help of blockchain and tokenization, I have yet to see projects that actually scale in an efficient way. So if you have any examples, that would be great.
So the question is, what are projects we've seen that have helped scale governance?
So, go ahead. I think there's been some early experiments. We're still really early in this phase. If you're talking about purely decentralized governance, I think there's maybe only a few. I mentioned MakerDAO before. Saya has some cool stuff on this. Basically, on-chain voting is the first primitive of decentralized governance. If you're talking about governance in a decentralized project, I think Ethereum has had a lot of good work and writings on this. How do you efficiently manage a corporation or a group of people that are building a a project that's not really run by any one single entity or person, but instead has a number of different stakeholders. So I think there's probably been more action on that side, but there are a number of companies, and we're hopefully looking to see that number grow over the next year or two in terms of people actively working on things like voting or general organization of a blockchain.
Yeah, I don't have any good examples yet. Certainly, where I've just joined, we're sensing the strong appetite for real-time information, which by definition means you have real-time governance. You can't make a decision based, or no one wants to kind of look back anymore and say, well, I'll look at the last year's financial reports and make a decision today, right? Or I'm going to look at the last quarter or even last month. You kind of want to know, yeah, that's history and interesting, but what's happened last week, or what's happening near real time. So I think there's a lot of pressure for results day to day, for information day to day, for real-time updates and insight. And that's only going to force the governance to become more and more real-time. And blockchain enables that kind of real-time governance, the decentralized, autonomous, less bureaucratic, less centralized decision-making. I think it's only natural that our appetite for data being now and immediate is going to force that push to governance to figure out how do we then govern now and immediately and real time.
So something I've been kind of curious about a lot lately is we have a lot of these projects that are based around utility tokens. It seems that there's two kind of counteracting things here. One is that the investors and companies themselves would like these tokens to go up in value, but at the same time, for a stable economy, you typically want a token to stay, or your main method of transactions to be relatively stable. So, I mean, how do you envision these projects in tokens succeeding if that is,
So for the projects where stability of the token engenders the future of the project, how do we manage conflicts in the like?
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
it seems like we want these tokens to go up in value, but at the same time, stable economies typically have a stable method of currency. So I'm kind of curious how these projects will succeed under that.
Yeah, so I think we're still experimenting with if utility tokens even make any sense in a blockchain network. To some degree, there's a level of speculation involved with all the valuations. I think the method with which we transact versus how a project earns money will probably separate in some degree. So the stablecoin experiment is this whole notion of like a stable value of us transacting. But I think there's a lot of cool experiments like utility tokens that potentially provide some sort of yield. And we were talking about governance before. As a way to govern a network, you have some sort of token that maybe provides a yield to incentivize you to vote on something. So today, there's no, I think, amazing examples of utility tokens that are truly valuable, but I think there's a lot of interesting experiments.
Agree completely, and I think I'm just starting to hear some discussion around kind of the benefits of kind of a multi-token in a utility environment, right? Where you have some sense of the token which is stable, persistent, and the kind of engine that runs, and then there's the value generating or value gaining token which complements it. But then the incentives and the interactions have to be worked out.
Yes.
Actually, a lot of enterprises kind of like being in control and empowered and centralized for various reasons, despite some of the modern ones that may seem like they're not. So, how do we encourage them that there is an alternative and it's worthwhile pursuing and how to change?
Well, I think so how do we encourage enterprise to see themselves as they are, decentralized and autonomous and in one way? Is that yeah.
Aside from a few kind of enterprises that make money out of open source,
Right.
most actually like to have their things.
I mean, I think the most important thing for enterprises to do today are to understand what the systems and processes are that really govern them. Like to be very explicit, because if they aren't looking at themselves that critically, someone else is going to do it for them, whether it's a blockchain company or another tech company.
Yeah, I think the one hook I've seen, or one area of interest I've seen at a corporate enterprise level is the notion of network effects, and that really control. Yes, you control the market. You have the IP, you have the control of the revenue, et cetera. But the growth there is limited to what you control, right? Whereas if you can find yourself in a corporate environment where network effects, expand that, explode it, then maybe losing control is actually a positive. But the lawyers, GCO would say, well, we'll get issues with that, right? But that's the one area where I think there's a big upside that enterprises are trying to figure out.
Yeah, I think it's tough to say today if the incumbent will embrace the technology and be first to market with it. But I think a lot of it too is just competitive factors of the market will drive value to one place or another. So I keep bringing up the monetary example, but it wasn't like Bitcoin was going to come out and every bank was going to adopt it and use that as the central money that they were going to use. Instead, someone created a new money that a small group of people and hopefully growing group of people are transacting with. And I think that will be the case for many applications as it relates to an enterprise.
Okay, with that, I want to thank Web3, Valet, and Ashley, and my fantastic panelists. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Niraj. Thank you all.